When my wealthy father-in-law told me I would never be good enough for his daughter and offered me $2 million to disappear from her life, I smiled, shook his hand, and agreed to his terms. What he didn't know was that his precious daughter had been cheating on me for 8 months with his business partner, and I had video evidence of them stealing money from his company. By the time I was finished, he lost his daughter, his business, and his fortune, while I walked away with everything he thought he could buy me out of. Before we continue with this incredible story of betrayal and perfectly calculated revenge, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our amazing revenge stories. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this ends. Let me know in the comments what you would have done in my situation. Now let me tell you exactly how I destroyed the man who thought money could solve everything. My name is David Martinez, and 3 years ago, I thought I was living every man's dream. I was married to Victoria Whitfield, the daughter of one of Chicago's wealthiest real estate moguls. We lived in a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, drove luxury cars, and attended charity galas where single bottles of wine cost more than most people's monthly rent. But dreams have a way of turning into nightmares when you discover they were built on lies. It was a Tuesday morning in October when everything started to unravel. I was sitting in my home office, reviewing architectural plans for a community center I was designing. My actual job, not the trophy husband role that Victoria's family assumed, was my only function. The doorbell rang at exactly 10:30 a.m., and I found Victoria's father, Richard Whitfield, standing in the hallway with 2 men in expensive suits. Richard was everything you'd expect from old Chicago money: silver hair, commanding presence, and the kind of confidence that came from never being told no in his entire 62 years of life. The 2 men with him looked like lawyers or accountants, the type who specialized in making problems disappear with the right paperwork. "David," Richard said without any greeting pleasantries, "we need to talk." I invited them into the living room, though something about Richard's tone made it clear this wasn't a social visit. Victoria was at her yoga class, or at least that's where she claimed to be every Tuesday and Thursday morning. Richard sat down in the leather chair that had cost more than my first car, while his companions remained standing like sentries. He opened a leather portfolio and pulled out a folder thick with documents. "David, you seem like a decent young man," he began, his voice carrying the kind of condescending tone that wealthy people perfected over generations. "But I think we both know that this marriage isn't working out the way anyone hoped." I kept my expression neutral, though my mind was racing. "What are you talking about, Richard? Victoria and I are happy." He smiled the way a shark might smile before attacking. "Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're a struggling architect married to a woman who's accustomed to a lifestyle you can't provide. You make, what, $80,000 a year? Victoria spends that much on handbags." The casual cruelty of his words was breathtaking, but I had learned to expect nothing less from Richard Whitfield. He had never approved of his daughter marrying someone from what he called the working class, even though my architectural firm was reasonably successful and growing. "I love your daughter, Richard, and I believe she loves me." "Love." He said the word like it tasted bitter. "David, love doesn't pay for penthouses or European vacations or the lifestyle Victoria deserves. You're holding her back from the life she was meant to live." One of his companions stepped forward and placed a document on the coffee table between us. It was a check made out to me for $2 million. "Here's what I'm proposing," Richard continued. "You take this money, disappear quietly from Victoria's life, and everyone wins. You get enough money to start over anywhere in the world, and Victoria gets the chance to find someone more suitable." I stared at the check, trying to process what was happening. My father-in-law was literally trying to buy me out of his daughter's life, like I was a business competitor he wanted eliminated. "And if I refuse?" Richard's smile turned cold. "Then life becomes very difficult for you, David. Your architectural firm depends on city contracts and zoning approvals. Those things can become complicated when you don't have the right connections. Your mortgage on this penthouse, which Victoria and I co-signed for, could be called in for technical violations. Your reputation in Chicago's business community could suffer from unfortunate rumors. The threat was clear, but delivered with the polish of someone who had been destroying people financially for decades. Richard Whitfield didn't just have wealth, he had power, connections, and the willingness to use both against anyone who opposed him. I picked up the check and examined it. $2 million, more money than I had ever seen in one place. Enough to pay off my student loans, buy a house anywhere in the country, and start fresh with complete financial security. "I need time to think about this," I said finally. "Of course. But David, don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't last forever." After they left, I sat alone in my penthouse, looking out at the lake and trying to understand what had just happened. My marriage was being treated like a business transaction that needed to be dissolved for the greater good of the Whitfield family fortune. I should have been angry. I should have been hurt. I should have called Victoria immediately and told her what her father had done. Instead, I found myself thinking about something that had been bothering me for months. Victoria's behavior, her secretive phone calls, her unexplained absences, her sudden lack of interest in physical intimacy. That afternoon, I did something I had never done before in our 3 years of marriage. I followed her. Victoria's yoga class was supposed to end at 11:30 a.m., but instead of coming home, she drove to the Four Seasons Hotel downtown. I watched from my car as she met someone in the lobby, a man I recognize as Thomas Chen, Richard's business partner and the co-owner of Whitfield and Chen Properties. Thomas was in his mid-40s, recently divorced, and worth approximately $50 million. He was also married to his second wife, Lisa, a former model who had given up her career to raise their twin daughters. I sat in that hotel parking lot for 2 hours, watching the entrance and thinking about the implications of what I was seeing. When Victoria finally emerged, she was adjusting her hair and checking her makeup in a way that suggested she hadn't been discussing real estate investments. That evening, Victoria came home acting completely normal, telling me about her yoga class and asking about my day as if nothing had happened. She kissed me goodbye before leaving for dinner with her college friends. Another lie I now realized. I spent that night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to decide what to do with the information I had gathered. My wife was having an affair with her father's business partner. Her father wanted to pay me to disappear, and I was caught in the middle of what was clearly a much more complicated situation than anyone realized. By morning, I had made my decision, but it wasn't the decision that Richard Whitfield expected. Instead of confronting Victoria or accepting Richard's buyout offer, I decided to become a detective in my own life. If my marriage was going to end, I wanted to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I made any moves that I couldn't take back. I hired Marcus Sullivan, a private investigator who specialized in matrimonial cases. Marcus was a former Chicago police detective with 20 years of experience in surveillance and evidence gathering. More importantly, he was completely invisible, the kind of middle-aged man who could blend into any crowd without being noticed. "David," Marcus said during our first meeting at his office in Lincoln Park, "I have to ask you something before we begin. Are you sure you want to know the truth? Because once I start digging, there's no going back. Some marriages can survive suspicion, but they rarely survive confirmation." I thought about his question seriously. Did I really want to know the extent of Victoria's betrayal? Was I prepared for whatever Marcus might discover? "I need to know everything," I said finally. "My father-in-law is trying to buy me out of my marriage for $2 million. My wife is acting like a stranger. I can't make informed decisions without complete information." Marcus nodded and opened a new file folder. "Tell me about your wife's routine, her friends, her habits, anything that might help me understand her patterns." For the next hour, I provided a detailed breakdown of Victoria's life, her Tuesday and Thursday yoga classes, her weekly dinners with college friends, her shopping trips, her volunteer work at the Children's Hospital. As I spoke, I realized how little I actually knew about how she spent her time. "What about finances?" Marcus asked. "Joint accounts, credit cards, investments?" This was where things got interesting. Victoria and I had separate checking accounts, but shared credit cards and a joint savings account. However, she also had access to a trust fund that her father controlled, and I had never seen detailed statements of her spending from that source. "I want you to document everything," I told Marcus. "Her affair, her spending, her daily activities. If this marriage is ending, I want to know exactly what I'm walking away from." And what if I find evidence of other problems? Financial irregularities, legal issues, things that go beyond just an extramarital affair. I hadn't considered that possibility, but Marcus's question made me realize that in wealthy families, personal betrayals were often connected to larger schemes involving money and power. Document everything, I repeated, no matter what you find. Over the next 3 weeks, Marcus provided me with daily reports that painted a picture of Victoria's life that was completely different from what I had believed. The yoga classes were indeed meetings with Thomas Chen, usually in hotel rooms around the city. The college friend dinners were actually gatherings with a group of wealthy women who spent their evenings at exclusive clubs and restaurants, gossiping about their marriages and planning expensive vacations. But Marcus's most important discovery had nothing to do with Victoria's affair. "David, I need to show you something," he said during our 4th week of surveillance. He spread a series of photographs across his desk, along with bank statements and financial documents that made my blood run cold. The photographs showed Thomas Chen and Victoria entering and leaving various properties around Chicago, not for romantic meetings, but for what appeared to be business transactions. The financial documents showed money transfers between Thomas's personal accounts and Victoria's trust fund, but the amounts and timing didn't match any legitimate investment activities. "What am I looking at?" I asked. Marcus pulled out a detailed timeline he had constructed. "I think Thomas and Victoria are skimming money from Whitfield and Chen properties. Look at these patterns. Every time the company reports a major sale or lease agreement, there are corresponding transfers into personal accounts that don't match the official commission structures." He showed me bank records that revealed a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts that Victoria and Thomas were using to hide money from both Richard Whitfield and Thomas's wife. "How much money are we talking about?" "Conservative estimate. They've stolen approximately $12 million over the past 2 years. But David, this isn't just embezzlement. They're also manipulating property values and zoning decisions to benefit their personal investments while harming the main company." I stared at the evidence, trying to process what Marcus was telling me. My wife wasn't just having an affair. She was involved in a massive fraud scheme that was stealing money from her own father's company. "There's more," Marcus continued. "I've been monitoring Thomas's communications with city officials. He's been bribing zoning commissioners to approve developments that benefit his side businesses while denying permits for projects that would compete with his investments." The scope of the corruption was staggering. Victoria and Thomas weren't just stealing money, they were manipulating Chicago's entire real estate development process for personal gain. "Marcus, I need you to document everything with the kind of evidence that would hold up in court. Financial records, communication intercepts, photographic evidence, witness statements, everything." "David, what are you planning to do with this information?" I looked at the photographs of my wife and her lover, the bank statements showing their theft, the evidence of their conspiracy against her own father. Richard Whitfield had tried to buy me out of his daughter's life for $2 million, not knowing that his daughter had already stolen 6 times that amount from his own company. "I'm going to give him exactly what he asked for," I said, "a solution to his family problem, but not the solution he was expecting." That evening, I called Richard Whitfield and arranged to meet him at his private club downtown. The Union League Club was the kind of place where Chicago's elite gathered to make deals and destroy enemies over 30-year-old scotch and imported cigars. Richard was waiting for me in a private dining room, seated at a mahogany table that probably cost more than most people's cars. He looked pleased to see me, assuming I was there to accept his buyout offer. "David, I'm glad you called. I was hoping you had time to consider my proposition." I sat down across from him and placed a leather portfolio on the table, not unlike the one he had brought to my apartment 3 weeks earlier. "I have considered it, Richard. And you're absolutely right about something. This marriage isn't working the way anyone hoped." His smile widened. "I'm pleased to hear you're being reasonable about this. $2 million is a generous offer for someone in your position." "It is generous," I agreed, "but I think there might be a misunderstanding about what position I'm actually in." I opened my portfolio and began placing photographs on the table. Pictures of Victoria and Thomas entering hotels, bank statements showing suspicious transfers, documents proving their embezzlement scheme. Richard's expression changed from confidence to confusion to horror as he processed what he was seeing. "What is this?" he asked quietly. "This is evidence that your daughter and your business partner have been stealing from your company for 2 years. Conservative estimate is $12 million, but the actual amount could be higher once forensic accountants complete their analysis." I continued placing documents on the table: communication intercepts, financial records, evidence of the bribery scheme involving zoning commissioners. Victoria and Thomas aren't just having an affair, Richard. They're planning to destroy your company from the inside while building their own competing business using money they've stolen from you. Richard's face had gone pale. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up one of the bank statements, studying the evidence of his daughter's betrayal. "This can't be accurate. Victoria wouldn't. She has access to her trust fund. She doesn't need to steal money. Her trust fund is controlled by you," I said. "She gets an allowance, but she can't access the principal without your approval." Thomas convinced her that they could build their own empire if they had sufficient startup capital, and your company provided that capital without your knowledge. I placed the final document on the table, a business plan that Marcus had intercepted from Thomas's email account. They're planning to leave Chicago once they've accumulated enough money. New identities, offshore accounts, a completely fresh start in a country that doesn't have extradition treaties with the United States. Your daughter was going to disappear from your life anyway, Richard. My presence or absence was completely irrelevant to their plans. Richard was quiet for a long time, reading through the evidence and trying to understand the scope of his daughter's betrayal. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to understand that I'm not the problem in Victoria's life. I'm not holding her back from greatness or preventing her from living up to her potential. She made her own choices, and those choices led her to steal from her family and plan to abandon everyone who ever loved her." "And the $2 million offer?" I smiled. "I'm going to accept it, but not for the reasons you originally proposed." Richard looked confused. "I don't understand. You offered me $2 million to disappear from Victoria's life so she could find someone more suitable. I'm going to take your money and disappear, but not because I'm inadequate. I'm disappearing because your daughter is a criminal who's about to face federal charges for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy." I pulled out one final document, a letter I had prepared with the help of my attorney. "This is my resignation from the Whitfield family drama. I'm taking your money, filing for divorce based on adultery and financial fraud, and starting over somewhere that doesn't involve family businesses or trust funds or people who think money can solve every problem." Richard read the letter, which outlined my knowledge of the embezzlement scheme and my intention to provide evidence to federal prosecutors. "You're going to destroy my daughter's life." "No, Richard. Your daughter destroyed her own life when she decided that stealing from her family was an acceptable way to fund her affair and her escape plan. I'm just making sure that justice is served and that you understand what kind of person you raised." "What about Thomas?" "He's my business partner, my friend for 20 years. Thomas is a criminal who seduced your daughter and convinced her to betray her own family. He's also married to a woman who deserves to know that her husband has been stealing money to fund affairs with younger women." I stood up, gathering my documents. "Richard, you have a choice to make. You can try to cover this up, protect your daughter and Thomas, and hope that the federal prosecutors don't discover their crimes on their own. Or you can cooperate with law enforcement, recover as much of the stolen money as possible, and salvage whatever remains of your business reputation. And if I choose to cover it up, then you become an accessory after the fact to federal crimes involving millions of dollars. Your business licenses get revoked, your assets get frozen during the investigation, and your reputation in Chicago becomes toxic. Plus, Victoria and Thomas continue stealing from you until they have enough money to disappear permanently." Richard was quiet for several minutes, staring at the evidence spread across the table. Finally, he looked up at me with something that might have been respect. "You knew about this when I offered you the buyout, didn't you?" I stood up, gathering my documents. "Richard, you have a choice to make. You can try to cover this up, protect your daughter and Thomas, and hope that the federal prosecutors don't discover their crimes on their own. Or you can cooperate with law enforcement, recover as much of the stolen money as possible, and salvage whatever remains of your business reputation." And if I choose to cover it up, then you become an accessory after the fact to federal crimes involving millions of dollars. Your business licenses get revoked, your assets get frozen during the investigation, and your reputation in Chicago becomes toxic. Plus, Victoria and Thomas continue stealing from you until they have enough money to disappear permanently. Richard was quiet for several minutes, staring at the evidence spread across the table. Finally, he looked up at me with something that might have been respect. You knew about this when I offered you the buyout, didn't you? I suspected Victoria was having an affair. I had no idea about the embezzlement scheme until I hired investigators to document her behavior. But yes, I knew she was cheating when you offered me money to disappear. And you still agreed to take the money? Richard, you insulted me, threatened my career, and tried to destroy my marriage because you thought I wasn't worthy of your daughter. Now I know that your daughter isn't worthy of me. Your money just makes it easier for me to start over, without any connection to this family or the crimes they've committed. I walked toward the door, then paused to deliver my final message. I'll give you 48 hours to decide how you want to handle the situation. After that, I'm turning over all the evidence to federal prosecutors and letting them sort out who gets prosecuted and who gets to cooperate. As I left the Union League Club, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: freedom. The golden cage of my marriage to Victoria was finally opening, and I was about to fly away with enough money to build whatever life I wanted. But Richard Whitfield and his criminal daughter were about to discover that escaping the consequences of their choices wouldn't be as easy as they had hoped. I didn't have to wait 48 hours for Richard's decision. The next morning, I received a call from his attorney requesting an immediate meeting to discuss terms for cooperation with law enforcement. The meeting was held at the offices of Morrison Wells and Associates, the same law firm that had helped me navigate my previous corporate legal issues. Richard arrived with 2 attorneys and a forensic accountant, looking like a man who had aged 10 years overnight. David, his lead attorney, began. Mr. Whitfield is prepared to cooperate fully with any criminal investigation, but he wants assurances about your intentions regarding the evidence you've collected. My intentions are simple, I replied. I want justice. Victoria and Thomas committed federal crimes, and they should face the consequences. I also want to ensure that the victims of their theft, including Richard and Thomas's wife, have the opportunity to recover their losses. And the $2 million payment? I'll accept it as agreed, but with modified terms. Instead of paying me to disappear quietly, Richard is paying me for the investigative work that uncovered the embezzlement scheme. It's a consulting fee for services that saved his company from further losses. Richard spoke for the first time since the meeting began. David, I owe you an apology. I misjudged you completely, and I tried to solve the wrong problem with the wrong methods. You tried to buy me off because you thought I was the weakness in Victoria's life. You didn't realize that Victoria was the weakness in her own life. His attorney placed a revised agreement on the table. Mr. Whitfield is prepared to pay you the $2 million as a consulting fee for your investigative services. In exchange, you agree to cooperate fully with law enforcement and to provide testimony if required during any criminal proceedings. I reviewed the agreement, which essentially paid me for exposing Victoria's crimes rather than for disappearing from her life. The irony was perfect. Richard had wanted to eliminate me from his family, and now he was paying me to eliminate his own daughter from his business. There's one more thing, I said. I want Richard to personally deliver the evidence to Thomas's wife. She deserves to know what her husband has been doing, and she deserves to hear it from someone she can trust rather than discovering it through a federal investigation. Richard looked physically ill at the thought of that conversation. David, Lisa Chen is a friend of my family. Her daughters play with my grandchildren. This will destroy her life. Thomas already destroyed her life when he decided to steal money and cheat on her. I'm just making sure she finds out before she loses any more time in a marriage built on lies. We spent the next several hours working out the details of our cooperation with federal prosecutors. Richard's attorneys had already contacted the FBI's white-collar crime unit, and agents were scheduled to begin their investigation within the week. But I had one more piece of business to handle before the federal authorities took over the case. That evening, I went home to the penthouse and waited for Victoria to return from another yoga class that I now knew was actually a planning session with Thomas about their escape strategy. She arrived at 7:30 p.m., cheerful and relaxed, completely unaware that her entire world was about to collapse. "Hi, honey," she said, kissing me on the cheek. "How was your day?" "Interesting," I replied. "I had lunch with your father." "Oh, what did you two talk about?" I pulled out my phone and showed her one of the photographs Marcus had taken, a picture of her and Thomas entering a hotel room together. Victoria's face went white. She sat down heavily on the couch, staring at the phone screen like it contained a death sentence. "David, I can explain." "Can you explain this?" I showed her bank statements documenting the stolen money. "Or this, financial records proving the embezzlement scheme. Or this, evidence of the bribery and corruption involving zoning commissioners." Victoria began crying, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of panic from someone whose carefully planned escape had just been exposed. "David, you don't understand. Thomas and I, we were trying to build something better, something that could provide security for both of us. You were stealing from your own father to fund your affair and your plan to disappear with a married man. It's not that simple." I sat down across from her, studying the face of someone I had thought I loved. "Victoria, make it simple for me. Explain how stealing $12 million from your family's company was justified. Explain how bribing city officials to manipulate real estate deals was ethical. Explain how planning to abandon your family and Thomas's children was the right thing to do." She couldn't answer any of those questions because there were no acceptable answers. Victoria had made a series of selfish choices that had led her deeper and deeper into criminal behavior, and now she was facing the consequences. "What are you going to do?" she asked finally. "I'm going to divorce you for adultery and fraud. I'm going to cooperate with the federal investigation that will probably send you to prison. And I'm going to take your father's money and start a new life somewhere that doesn't include people who think crime is an acceptable business strategy." "David, please. We can work this out. Thomas has contacts overseas. We can all disappear together. You're asking me to become a fugitive from justice to help you escape punishment for stealing millions of dollars from your own family. I'm asking you to help me because you love me." I looked at her for a long moment, trying to remember what I had ever seen in this person who was now asking me to abandon my principles and my integrity to help her escape justice. "Victoria, I did love you. I love the person I thought you were, but that person was apparently a fiction. The real you is sitting in front of me asking me to become a criminal to help you avoid the consequences of your crimes." I stood up and walked toward the bedroom to pack my clothes. "I'm moving out tonight. My attorney will serve you with divorce papers tomorrow. The FBI will probably contact you within a few days to discuss your cooperation with their investigation. And if I refuse to cooperate, then you go to prison for 20 years instead of 10. Your choice." I packed 2 suitcases with my essential belongings and left the penthouse that had been my home for 3 years. As I drove away, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Relief that I was finally free from the golden cage of the Whitfield family dysfunction. But Victoria and Thomas were about to discover that escaping the consequences of federal crimes was much more difficult than escaping from an unhappy marriage. The FBI investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Within 2 weeks, federal agents had raided the offices of Whitfield and Chen Properties, frozen multiple bank accounts, and executed search warrants on both Victoria's and Thomas's residences. I was cooperating as a key witness, providing testimony about what I had discovered and the evidence that Marcus Sullivan had gathered during our investigation. The federal prosecutors were particularly interested in the bribery scheme involving zoning commissioners, which had implications for several major development projects around the city. But the most satisfying moment came when I accompanied Richard to deliver the news to Lisa Chen, Thomas's wife. Lisa lived in a magnificent home in Lincoln Park, a restored Victorian mansion that Thomas had purchased with money that, we now knew, had been stolen from Richard's company. She greeted us at the door with the kind of warm hospitality that came from years of entertaining her husband's business associates. "Richard, David, what a pleasant surprise. Come in, come in. Can I get you coffee? Tea?" Richard and I exchanged glances. He had insisted on handling this conversation personally, feeling that Lisa deserved to hear the truth from someone she trusted rather than from strangers and law enforcement. We sat in Lisa's living room, surrounded by family photos that showed her and Thomas with their twin daughters at various school events and family vacations. The pictures told the story of what appeared to be a happy, stable family, built on success and mutual devotion. "Lisa," Richard began, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to reveal. "I need to tell you something about Thomas that you're going to find very difficult to hear." Over the next hour, Richard explained the entire situation, the affair, the embezzlement, the escape plan that would have abandoned both families. Lisa listened in complete silence, her face growing paler with each revelation. When Richard finished, he placed copies of the evidence on her coffee table. Photographs, bank statements, communication intercepts that proved her husband's betrayal and criminal behavior. Lisa studied the documents for a long time, occasionally asking quiet questions about dates or financial details. Finally, she looked up at both of us with eyes that were dry but filled with a kind of cold fury I had never seen before. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. "The affair started about 8 months ago," I replied. "The embezzlement has been happening for approximately 2 years. And Thomas was planning to disappear with Victoria, leaving me and the girls with nothing?" Richard nodded. The plan was to drain as much money as possible from the company, then disappear to a non-extradition country where they could start fresh with new identities. Lisa was quiet for several minutes, processing the scope of her husband's betrayal. When she spoke again, her voice was steady but filled with determination. "What can I do to help you destroy him?" The question surprised both Richard and me. We had expected tears, denial, or attempts to protect her family's reputation. Instead, Lisa was ready to join our campaign for justice. "Lisa," Richard said carefully, "I understand you're angry, but you should consider your daughters." "I am considering my daughters," she interrupted. "I'm considering the fact that their father was planning to abandon them and steal their college funds to run away with his mistress. I'm considering the fact that he's been lying to all of us for years while committing federal crimes that could destroy our family's reputation and financial security." She stood up and walked to a wall safe hidden behind one of the family portraits. "Thomas thinks I don't know about his personal business activities, but I've been married to him for 12 years. I know where he keeps his backup files, his emergency cash, his insurance policies against business disasters." Lisa opened the safe and pulled out several folders containing documents that made Richard's eyes widen with surprise. "These are records of every bribe Thomas paid to city officials over the past 5 years, bank routing information, meeting schedules, even recordings of some conversations where he discusses illegal activities. I started collecting this information 2 years ago, when I suspected he was hiding money from me." She handed the folders to Richard. "I was planning to use this evidence in a divorce proceeding to ensure I got a fair settlement. But now I think it would be more useful for federal prosecutors who are building a criminal case." The evidence Lisa provided was devastating. Thomas had been far more corrupt than even Marcus's investigation had revealed, with a network of bribes and illegal activities that extended throughout Chicago's development and zoning bureaucracy. "Lisa," I said, "this evidence could send Thomas to prison for decades. Are you sure you want to be responsible for that?" Her smile was cold as winter wind off Lake Michigan. "David, my husband, was planning to abandon me and my daughters after stealing millions of dollars from his best friend. He was going to leave us with nothing while he started a new life with his mistress. The only thing I'm responsible for is making sure he faces the full consequences of his choices." That evening, Richard and I delivered Lisa's evidence to federal prosecutors, who were amazed by the scope and detail of the corruption they now had documented. The case against Victoria and Thomas was no longer just about embezzlement. It was about systematic corruption that had affected dozens of real estate projects and cost taxpayers millions of dollars in fraudulent deals. But my personal satisfaction came from a different source. That night, I received a call from Marcus Sullivan with an update on Victoria's current situation. "David, you're going to love this," Marcus said, his voice filled with amusement. "Victoria tried to run. She cleaned out her remaining bank accounts and bought a plane ticket to Brazil under a fake identity that Thomas had arranged for their escape plan." "Tried to run?" Airport security flagged her fake passport. "She's been in federal custody since this morning, charged with attempting to flee the country to avoid prosecution. The judge denied bail based on flight risk." I smiled, thinking about Victoria sitting in a federal detention center, probably wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of the designer clothes that had defined her identity for so many years. What about Thomas? Thomas is trying to negotiate a plea deal, but Lisa's evidence has made that almost impossible. The prosecutors have him dead to rights on multiple federal felonies. He's looking at 15 to 20 years minimum. As I hung up the phone, I reflected on how completely my life had changed in just a few weeks. A month ago, I had been trapped in a loveless marriage, living in a golden cage funded by people who despised me. Now I was free, wealthy, and watching justice being served to people who had thought they were above the law. Richard Whitfield had tried to buy me out of his daughter's life for $2 million, assuming I was the problem that needed to be solved. Instead, I had used his money to expose the real problems: his daughter's criminal behavior and her conspiracy with his business partner. Victoria had thought she could steal from her family and abandon her marriage without consequences. Thomas had believed his wealth and connections made him untouchable. Both of them were about to spend the next decade in federal prison, learning that choices have consequences regardless of how much money you have. But my revenge was just beginning. 6 months later, I was sitting in a coffee shop in San Francisco, reading the Chicago Tribune's coverage of Victoria and Thomas's sentencing hearing. The headlines were everything I could have hoped for. Whitfield heiress sentenced to 12 years for embezzlement. Real estate mogul gets 18 years in federal prison. Corruption scandal rocks Chicago development industry. The articles detailed how Victoria had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for embezzlement, conspiracy, and attempting to flee prosecution. Thomas had received 18 years for his more extensive criminal activities, including the bribery scheme that had corrupted dozens of real estate deals. But the most satisfying detail was buried in the third paragraph of the Tribune's main story. The investigation was triggered by evidence provided by David Martinez, the estranged husband of Victoria Whitfield, who uncovered the embezzlement scheme during divorce proceedings. I had become the hero of the story, the wronged husband who exposed corruption and helped federal authorities recover millions of dollars in stolen money. Richard Whitfield, who had once tried to buy me out of his daughter's life, was now publicly praising my integrity and cooperation with law enforcement. My phone rang as I was reading the articles. The caller ID showed Richard's number. "David, I wanted to call and thank you again for everything you've done. Without your investigation, Victoria and Thomas would have escaped with millions more dollars, and I would never have known what happened to my company." "How are you holding up, Richard?" There was a long pause. "Honestly, I'm devastated. I failed as a father, and I nearly lost everything because I couldn't see what my own daughter was capable of. But I'm also grateful that you had the courage to expose the truth." Richard's business had survived the scandal, though it had taken a significant effort to rebuild relationships with clients and city officials who had been affected by Thomas's corruption. He had also paid substantial restitution to victims of the bribery scheme and implemented new internal controls to prevent future fraud. "Richard, there's something I need to tell you. I've been thinking about our first conversation when you offered me $2 million to disappear from Victoria's life. David, I'm still ashamed of that conversation. I was wrong about everything." "You weren't entirely wrong. You said Victoria needed someone more suitable for her lifestyle. You were right. She needed someone who was willing to commit federal crimes to maintain the standard of living she expected. I wasn't suitable for that kind of partnership." Richard was quiet for a moment. "David, where are you now? What are you doing with your life?" I looked out the window of my San Francisco coffee shop at the Golden Gate Bridge in the distance. "I'm rebuilding. I use your money to start a new architectural firm that specializes in sustainable community development. We're working on projects that actually help people instead of just making wealthy investors wealthier." "And are you happy?" It was a simple question, but it made me realize how fundamentally my definition of happiness had changed. A year ago, happiness had meant expensive dinners, luxury vacations, and the approval of people who measured success by the size of their bank accounts. Now happiness meant building something meaningful with my own hands and skills. "I'm free, Richard. I'm free from the golden cage of your family's expectations, free from a marriage built on lies, and free to build whatever kind of life I want. That's better than happiness. That's authenticity." After we hung up, I spent the afternoon walking through Golden Gate Park, thinking about the chain of events that had led me from Chicago to San Francisco, from trophy husband to independent entrepreneur, from victim to victor. But my story wasn't quite finished yet. 1 year later, I received a visitor at my San Francisco office that I had never expected to see again. Lisa Chen walked into my conference room looking like a completely different person from the devastated wife I had left behind in Chicago. "David, I hope you don't mind me coming here unannounced. I was in San Francisco on business, and I wanted to thank you personally for everything you did." Lisa had indeed transformed herself. She was now the sole owner of Chen Properties, having rebuilt Thomas's business from the ruins of the federal investigation. She had also remarried to a pediatrician who shared her values about integrity and family, and was raising her daughters in an environment free from the corruption that had defined their early years. "How did you manage to rebuild the business?" I asked. "It wasn't easy. I had to pay significant restitution to victims of Thomas's crimes, and I spent 2 years rebuilding relationships with clients who had been affected by his corruption. But I had advantages that Thomas never understood." Such as, Lisa smiled with the confidence of someone who had survived the worst betrayal imaginable and emerged stronger. "I had a reputation for honesty. People in Chicago knew that I wasn't involved in Thomas's crimes, and they were willing to work with me once they understood that I was building a completely different kind of company." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a business plan that made my eyes widen with surprise. "David, I have a proposition for you. I'm expanding Chen Properties into sustainable development projects that focus on community benefit rather than just profit maximization. I need an architectural partner who shares those values and has experience in community-focused design." The business plan outlined a series of affordable housing projects, community centers, and environmental restoration initiatives that would be funded through a combination of private investment and public partnerships. It was exactly the kind of work I had hoped to focus on when I started my new firm. "Lisa, this is impressive, but why do you want to partner with me specifically? There are plenty of architects in Chicago who could handle these projects. Because you proved that doing the right thing is more important than protecting yourself or maintaining comfortable relationships. When you discovered Thomas and Victoria's crimes, you could have kept quiet and protected your own interests. Instead, you chose justice, even though it meant destroying your marriage and your comfortable lifestyle." She placed a partnership agreement on the table. "I need someone I can trust completely, someone who has already proven that they won't compromise their integrity for money or convenience. You're the only person I know who meets those criteria." I reviewed the partnership terms, which were more generous than anything I could have negotiated independently. Lisa was offering me equal partnership in projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars, with the understanding that our work would focus on community benefit rather than just profit. "There's one more thing," Lisa said, pulling out a final document. "This is a report from the federal prison system about Victoria and Thomas's current situation." The report detailed how both of them were adjusting to prison life. Victoria, who had never worked a day in her life, was now employed in the prison laundry facility and had been denied parole due to her continued refusal to accept responsibility for her crimes. Thomas was serving his time in a minimum security facility, but had lost his appeals and would likely serve the full 18-year sentence. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. "Because I thought you might want to know that justice is continuing to be served. Victoria and Thomas destroyed multiple families and stole millions of dollars, but they're paying the price every day they spend in prison." I studied the prison reports, thinking about Victoria sitting in a cell instead of the penthouse we had shared, working in a laundry instead of shopping for designer clothes. The contrast was so complete that it felt like reading about a fictional character rather than someone I had once loved. "Lisa, do you ever feel guilty about the role you played in sending Thomas to prison?" "Guilty?" She laughed, but there was steel in her voice. "David, Thomas was planning to abandon me and our daughters after stealing millions of dollars. He was going to leave us with nothing while he started a new life with his mistress. The only thing I feel guilty about is not exposing him sooner." That evening, I called Richard to tell him about Lisa's partnership offer and to get his perspective on the woman who had once been married to his business partner. "Lisa Chen is remarkable," Richard said. "She took a company that was destroyed by scandal and rebuilt it into something better than it had ever been before. She also raised 2 daughters who are honor students and volunteers in their community, despite everything their father put them through. What about the business partnership? Do you think it's a good idea for me to move back to Chicago and work with her? Richard was quiet for a moment. David, I think you should do whatever makes you happy and allows you to build the kind of life you want. But I will say this, Lisa Chen is the kind of person who makes everyone around her better. If you partner with her, you'll be working with someone who shares your values and your commitment to doing the right thing. 2 weeks later, I was back in Chicago, signing partnership agreements with Lisa and preparing to launch a new phase of my career focused on sustainable community development. 3 years after Victoria's sentencing, I was standing in the lobby of the Chicago Community Center we had just completed. A beautiful, sustainable building that provided educational and recreational services to one of the city's underserved neighborhoods. The project had been funded through a combination of private investment and city partnerships, and it represented exactly the kind of work I had hoped to focus on when I left the golden cage of the Whitfield family. Lisa walked over, carrying 2 cups of coffee and smiling with the satisfaction of someone who had just watched a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a project that would benefit thousands of families. David, I have something to show you, she said, pulling out her phone to display a news article from that morning's Chicago Tribune. The headline read, "Whitfield heiress denied parole for 3rd time." The article explained that Victoria had been denied parole again because prison psychologists determined she had not accepted responsibility for her crimes and showed no genuine remorse for the harm she had caused to her family and victims. 12 years in federal prison, and she still hasn't learned anything, Lisa observed. Some people are just incapable of growth or change. I thought about Victoria sitting in prison, still convinced that she was the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of her own destruction. In contrast, Lisa had taken the worst betrayal imaginable and used it as motivation to build something better for herself and her daughters. Lisa, do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't discovered the embezzlement scheme? If Victoria and Thomas had succeeded in their escape plan? I think about it sometimes. They would have disappeared with $20 or $30 million, leaving both our families destroyed. Thomas's daughters would have grown up thinking their father abandoned them for no reason. Your reputation would have been ruined by Richard's campaign to eliminate you from Victoria's life, and both of us would have spent years wondering what we did wrong to drive away the people we loved. The irony was perfect. Richard Whitfield had tried to pay me to disappear from his daughter's life because he thought I was holding her back from greatness. Instead, I had discovered that his daughter was holding herself back through criminal behavior and moral corruption. Victoria had thought she could steal from her family and abandon her marriage without consequences. She was now serving year 9 of a 12-year sentence, with no guarantee of parole even when she became eligible. Thomas had believed his wealth and connections made him untouchable. He was serving year 9 of an 18-year sentence in federal prison, with his wife having rebuilt his business empire without him. But the most satisfying aspect of my revenge wasn't the prison sentences or the financial losses suffered by people who had betrayed me. The most satisfying aspect was the life I had built from the ashes of their betrayal. My architectural firm was now one of the most respected sustainable development companies in the Midwest. I had remarried to Sarah, an environmental lawyer who shared my values and my commitment to community service. We lived in a restored brownstone in Lincoln Park, within walking distance of the community center that had become a symbol of everything we were trying to accomplish. Most importantly, I had learned to measure success not by the size of bank accounts or the expense of possessions, but by the positive impact we could have on the communities where we worked. That evening, Sarah and I were having dinner at home when she asked me a question that made me realize how completely my life had changed. David, do you ever regret the way things worked out with Victoria? Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had tried to save your marriage instead of exposing her crimes? I thought about her question seriously. 3 years earlier, I might have felt guilty about my role in sending Victoria to prison. I might have wondered if I could have helped her become a better person instead of destroying her life through legal consequences. But now I understood that Victoria had made her own choices, and those choices had defined who she was as a person. I hadn't destroyed her life. I had simply ensured that she faced the consequences of her own decisions. Sarah, I spent 3 years married to someone who was lying to me every day. She was stealing from her own family, planning to abandon everyone who loved her and asking me to help her escape justice for federal crimes. That's not the kind of person you can save. That's the kind of person you need to escape from. And do you think justice was served? I looked around our home, filled with books and art and evidence of a life built on authenticity rather than appearance. Through the window, I could see the community center where dozens of families were participating in evening programs that provided education and opportunities for their children. Victoria was in prison because she had chosen crime over honesty. Thomas was in prison because he had chosen corruption over integrity. Lisa had rebuilt her life because she had chosen courage over comfort. I had found happiness because I had chosen justice over convenience. Yeah, I said finally, justice was served. Not just through prison sentences, but through the opportunity for all of us to build better lives based on better choices. Epilogue, 5 years later. I'm writing this from my office overlooking the Chicago River, where I can see 3 different community development projects that my firm has completed over the past 5 years. Each building represents thousands of hours of work focused on sustainable design, community benefit, and the kind of authentic success that comes from helping others, rather than just accumulating wealth. Victoria was finally granted parole last month after serving 10 years of her 12-year sentence. According to the news reports, she has found employment as a bookkeeper for a small nonprofit organization and is living in a studio apartment on the South Side. She has never attempted to contact me or her father, and I hope she never does. Thomas was denied parole and will serve his full 18-year sentence. His daughters, now in their 20s, have both graduated from college and have successful careers. They visit their father occasionally but have built their lives around the values their mother taught them, rather than the corruption he represented. Lisa and I have expanded our partnership to include projects in 6 different cities, focusing on affordable housing, environmental restoration, and community development. Our work has been featured in Architectural Digest and won several awards for sustainable design. But the recognition I'm most proud of comes from the families who live and work in the buildings we've created. Richard Whitfield retired from active business management, but serves on the board of several charitable organizations focused on financial literacy and corruption prevention. He has never remarried and spends most of his time with his remaining family and community service projects. Last week, I received a letter that reminded me why the choices I made 5 years ago were the right ones. Dear Mr. Martinez, my name is Maria Santos, and my family lives in the Chicago Community Center apartments that your firm designed. I wanted to write to thank you for creating a place where my children can grow up safely and have access to educational programs that will help them build successful lives. I don't know if you realize this, but your building has changed everything for families like mine. My daughter Sophia is now in her 2nd year at Northwestern University, studying engineering because of the tutoring and mentorship programs available at the community center. My son Miguel is captain of the debate team and has been accepted to 3 different colleges. Before we moved to your building, we lived in places where my children's biggest aspiration was just to survive their teenage years without getting involved in drugs or gangs. Now they're planning careers as engineers and doctors and teachers. Thank you for believing that people like us deserve beautiful, safe places to live and opportunities to build better lives for our families. Gratefully yours, Maria Santos. That letter is now framed on my office wall, next to my architectural licenses and project awards. It represents everything I learned from the collapse of my marriage to Victoria and the discovery of her criminal behavior. Richard Whitfield once offered me $2 million to disappear from his daughter's life because he thought I wasn't good enough for her lifestyle. He was right, but not in the way he intended. I wasn't good enough for a lifestyle built on lies, theft, and moral corruption. I was built for something better, a life based on honesty, community service, and authentic relationships. Victoria thought she could steal from her family and escape consequences through wealth and connections. She learned that federal crimes have federal consequences, regardless of how much money you have or who you know. Thomas believed that corruption was just another business tool that could be used without personal cost. He discovered that systematic fraud eventually catches up with everyone, no matter how carefully they think they've covered their tracks. The revenge I got wasn't just about prison sentences or financial losses for people who had betrayed me. The revenge was building a life so much better than what I had lost that I could honestly say I was grateful for the betrayal that had freed me from the golden cage of the Whitfield family dysfunction. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well, building something meaningful, and proving that authenticity creates more value than corruption ever could. But most importantly, I learned that when someone shows you who they really are through their choices and actions, believe them the first time. Victoria showed me she was willing to lie, steal, and abandon everyone who loved her for personal gain. I should have believed that revelation instead of trying to save a marriage that was built on deception. The $2 million that was supposed to buy me out of Victoria's life instead bolt me into a life worth living. And that ultimately was the most satisfying revenge of all.